Hey guys, Jeremy here with Simple Little Life. Thank you so much for your support here on Patreon. I really do appreciate it, and I hope that you enjoy this. This is an exclusive voiceover build video of this Japanese-style kitchen cleaver. This was a knife that actually a client of mine had, he gave me some ideas of what he wanted, and then I did a few different designs, and we went back and forth several times until he had what he wanted here, and this is kind of a version of that. Actually, it's changed a little bit since then. This original one, I ended up shorting down the handle about an inch. Is a little bit too long, as well as kind of where the handle's drawn in there. We ended up moving that a little bit closer. You'll see in the very final product, but I ended up, after I had cut the material out, I thought, you know what, this thing is just way too big. I'm going to go ahead and shorten up that handle a little bit. So after we kind of rough it out there, this is a 1/8 inch Nitro V. This is a 3-inch wide bar. And then we'll just chop it up in the portable bandsaw with the old 14 tooth per inch blades. Those things work fantastic. And these are just the Milwaukee brand. This little portable bandsaw is probably what I would say, probably one of the most valuable tools when I got into knife making. Absolutely love that thing. Use it all the time. It's one of these tools people ask me often, do you think I should invest in a portable bandsaw? And I'm like, yeah, if you want to be building with metal, if you want to be doing stuff, absolutely. So once we've got that cut out, we're just going to profile it here on the grinder. I'm using a 50 grit ceramic belt. Love the ceramic belts. I've actually started to do some aluminum oxide on certain steps of the knives, but mostly still, I'm just a huge fan of ceramics. They last so long, especially get into the like the 50 grits and stuff. I've actually got some 24 grit belts that I'll use when I'm working with like 1/4 inch stock and grinding, like rough grinding my bevels. It's unbelievable the way those things hog material down. So anyways, we're just going to get a rough profile here and do everything kind of on the outsides first, and then we'll work on small inside corners and using the small contact wheel here on my belt grinder. Now this one actually didn't get too carried away before put the handles on, because obviously, you know, I'm not looking for a perfect finish at this stage of the game, because once we glue up handles, we're going to have to bring it all down to the metal anyways. So I actually leave a lot of the outside profiling rough now. More than I used to, and I just find it saves that little bit of time. Rather than worrying about getting everything perfect when you're going to have to go over it anyways, you may as well just do it all at once the handles are bolted on. And speaking of bolting on the handles, we are drilling the holes here. Now, I'm not actually going to use pins for this blade. I'm going to use Corby bolts. The reason for that, the scales that I had, that I'm using for this, my customer actually had them custom made by another maker, and they were a little bit warped. Not too bad. I mean, ultimately, it's really, really hard to get perfect scales. The best scales that I've ever had are from Rob's Wildwood, hands down, no questions asked. So these ones had a bit of a banana in them, and for me to grind them flat would end up taking a whole bunch of the G10 liner off. So I just thought if I use some Corby's, it's going to kind of help bring it into straight. Just, you know, even once you clamp it and glue it, it should be fine. But those Corby's just give a little bit of extra mechanical fastening there to help you out. Anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves. We are not at that step yet. So we're making a stainless steel foil wrap here. The reason for this is we want to create an inert environment so that we don't decarburize, basically burn up the carbon in the steel, because we're going to be going to such high temperatures with this blade. We're going to go to 1950 degrees, soak it there for about 20 minutes, and if we just left it in the kiln, those kilns are not airtight. They actually vent through the control panel, and we just let so much oxygen in there, and we'd just be burning up the carbon in this blade. Not a good thing. Now, that was a real quick little trick using baby powder on the blade. Some stainless steels, Nitro V in particular, is terrible for it, but it'll actually kind of almost weld itself to the tool wrap once you're up to those high temperatures. In fact, I've had one Nitro V that I couldn't get it off. I actually had to grind it down, and I find a little bit of talcum powder on there will completely stop that. The blade comes out clean every time, and there's no ill effect. It's interesting because it seems like the talcum powder is not affected in any way, shape, or form by the heat. It's still kind of on there. It's still a little bit white, and you just kind of blow it off when you're done, and you're good to go. So we did the plate quench there very quickly. It probably takes less than a minute, and you're down to like 100, you know, basically you can pick it up and handle it. And then we'll just cut our pouch out and make sure everything looks good. We got some really cool heat treat colors. That's fairly typical. It's so hard to predict when it happens, why it happens. Obviously, if you get a hole in your pouch, you'll get like black. It'll be like really, really dark. But it's really neat, some of these heat treat colors you can get. I wish I knew, you know, if you could control those like you could a Hamon or something. I think that'd be really interesting. Now getting ready to do our cryogenic treatment. What I did is I took 3 knives, actually. There's 3 different blades there, and I clamped them between some 3/8" thick pieces of steel. And 2 of the blades were warped when I started the cryo process and the tempering process. But by the time we had gone through it all, and I tempered them twice at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, every single blade was straight as an arrow. So that's really nice. And very often I find that helps when I cryo the blades when they're clamped in, and then also when I do the tempering when they're clamped. So it's just kind of holding it straight, letting it, all that stuff happen when you're heat treating. And then it does it in its straight form, and these things came out perfectly straight, and I was really thrilled about that. Now we're going to start grinding. So I'm starting off here with a 50 grit ceramic belt. I like those a lot. The 36 I find with some of these stainless, they disappear really quickly because it just kind of, especially when you got those hard edges, it just kind of knocks all the abrasive off, the big chunks of abrasive. So I really like the 50 grit is kind of where I start, 50 or 60. And then right here, you kind of notice how I'm holding the blade upright. That's because this is a full flat grind. And I find that's a really quick, slick little way to kind of get everything nice and flat and true. And then once we've got that done, we ended up doing a slight convex or radius. The biggest reason for this is that I didn't want to hand sand this knife at all. It's a 3-inch wide blade. It's long. You think about it, even your sanding paddles would have to be at least 3 inches wide so you can get nice, consistent results. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do anything I can to get a belt finish on this. And with the rotary platen there, I went to the Trizact belts. That was an A65 Trizact. And then jump into the Scotch-Brite. This is just a fine Scotch-Brite, and I was able to get a really nice finish, and 0 hand sanding on this blade whatsoever. It's kind of like my goal in life, is to never ever hand sand. Even though I make really handy sanding blocks. I mean, when you have to sand, it's nice to have a sanding block, but 0 hand sanding, that's my motto. And now we're just kind of drilling out the holes. So the Corby bolts, obviously you've got that thinner diameter that goes, through the tang of the knife, and then it kind of gets bigger. It's got a shoulder on it that kind of grabs and compresses. So obviously the holes that we drill through the wood, the first ones are just the minor diameter of the Corby bolts, of the female part of the Corby bolt. And then here you go, we're kind of putting them together. And then what I'm doing now is I'm going to counter bore for the diameter of the outside part. These are 1/4-inch Corby bolts. So I just kind of mark out roughly how deep I'd like to go with my 1/4-inch drill bit. Obviously not drilling it straight through because that would kind of defeat the whole purpose. The one nice thing with the Corby bolts, if you did make a mistake and you ended up going all the way through with your outer diameter, as long as the little slot for the screw doesn't go below the surface, you can still get away with it. It essentially just becomes like a pin at that point. But that's the one thing about these, is that there is a little bit of safety built into them. But I really wanted to make sure I had that shoulder kind of clamping everything together. So we just used our drill press, and I kind of marked the stop depth there. Showed it lots of my videos, but that's what we did to control the depth. And that way we can use those fasteners for a little bit of compression while we're gluing it up. Now we're just going to do some very rough shaping of the handle scales. This part here where we meet the blade, that needs to be finished before we glue up. So I'm just kind of freehand guessing a little bit of a radius on there, and then using this fancy dancy little tool holder thing or work rest that I made. I have it set to 45 degrees, lots of other ways you can get that angle, and then just had some lines that I marked out with a surface plate, and I'm grinding to them so we can get a nice chamfer on there. And again, that wants to be, you need to get that all set up before you go ahead and glue your scales on. Also, before we glue the scales on, I want to clean up that little inside finger choil area. I guess it's not technically a finger choil, but I'm just kind of rounding it out there on my small contact wheel, and then I'll finish it up by hand. I take little pieces of emery cloth and just kind of rip them into little 1/4-inch size strips and just kind of sand that in there, get a really nice radius on it, because if you're going to be working with this knife for a long time, your fingers are going to be in contact with that, and you want to make it as comfortable as possible. It also looks really good when the knife is done. Just one of those little tiny details. It's like, oh, okay, I don't know. That's one of my favorite parts of a knife, of a kitchen knife, is that nicely rounded inside choil there. So now I'm going to put my maker's mark on this thing. One tip I had from Shady Grady on Instagram, you can check that out. he told me to use these clear vinyl stencils. So these are basically stencils I cut out with my vinyl cutter. And when you use the clear, you can position it exactly where you want it to be on the blade. And that is a huge help. Also, I find marking it out before I put my handles on. That way I can kind of line it up. I never used to do it. I always used to do my marking at the very end. To me, I think that's just silly now because it's so much easier to get really close to where your handle terminates there. When you can do it beforehand, you can kind of slide the template or the little stencil underneath the handle, adjust it as you need to, and so that's pretty much how I like to do it from now on. Now that we've got everything cleaned up at the top there, where the handle ends at the blade, we're going to go ahead and wipe everything down, get ready for glue up. And just using a 2-part epoxy, DevCon 5-minute epoxy. Really enjoy this stuff. And one thing I find helps real well is I got these little tiny stubby screwdrivers. For these Corby bolts, it's really nice because then you're not, reaching out inches away, like 6 inches away from your handle skills. You're right there, a lot more control. And then these are just El Cheapos, so they're covered in epoxy and it doesn't bother me at all. One thing that's important too, you want to put a little epoxy inside the top of the holes when you're doing these, just to make sure that the epoxy squishes up and through, kind of seals all around the outer diameter, the larger diameter of those Corby bolts. And then the rest of it finishes up pretty much just like, gluing on regular scales with pins. Always like to make sure once you put one side on, I fill those little holes up, the holes between the tang with epoxy. You want to make sure you have a lot of epoxy running between both scales. It just kind of helps, ensures those things stay together. And then we'll put the other half on, put our Corbies in. Give these a tighten. Now, if you've never used the Corby bolts before, you don't want to hog down on these things. They're, you'll only have 3 or 4 threads engaged if you do it properly, and they're not meant for like really high tension, right? So I'll kind of snug them up a little bit, then I'll clamp them, and after I clamp everything together, then I'll go back and re-snug them. And it's amazing how many, you get an extra quarter turn or half a turn without even having to hog on it after you clamp it. So make sure you're not going to use those things with a lot of clamping force. Corbies are really nice. There's a place for them. They're a lot of extra work because you have the 2 different hole diameters to be working with. But times like this, when I've got a little bit of a warp in my scales, it's nice to be able to have the Corbies there just as a little added tension that you can bring and hold everything together. So once we've got it all glued up, just make sure that we have all the squeeze out taken care of, wiped up, and then we're going to let it dry. And actually let this dry overnight. I'm just wearing the same shirt that I wore the day before. That's how I usually like to wear my outer garments twice when I'm in the shop. Otherwise, it's just so much laundry for my wife. And also, I don't work with anybody. It's just me by myself, so I can be a little bit slobby if I want to. Now that we've got that done, I'll cut off the heads of the Corbies. When you're grinding brass, obviously it heats up a lot quicker than the wood. I used to try grinding these down, but by the time you were close to the surface of the scales, those things would have overheated so much, and a lot of times you can actually melt out and kind of burn out your epoxy. So I'm always careful. I try to cut off as much as I can with all pin material, actually, not just the brass. Even the composites, sometimes those will discolor as you heat them up, the fiberglass ones and stuff. So I always try and cut them down, then grind them flush. And then once we've got that done, we've basically got flat scales. Now I can rely on the work rests on my different grinding attachments to keep everything at 90 degrees. So we're using the big wheel there to get the back of the knife, and then we use a small contact wheel here to do the inside part. And a really important part when you're doing that is that you keep your strokes nice and even. That way you get a nice surface finish. Those small wheels, I find if you kind of hold up in any spot whatsoever, you get little tiny grooves in there, almost like little washboarding happening. And that can't even just be from the type of belt you're using. Sometimes where the joint is, it has a little tick-tick as it comes around. So I find it's really important to just keep everything moving. Start and do like continuous sweeps when I'm grinding those. Now we're just kind of marking out a series of lines here. We're going to use that back line that I just marked out. That's going to be where we're going to do the hollow grind. And then the angle at the top there, we're going to grind that right flat. You'll see that as we come up here. This is actually a really easy way to shape handle scales. I like the Coke bottle. A lot of people don't like it, but it feels really well. It feels great in the hand. And as far as like a utilitarian standpoint, they're really, really comfortable. I quite like them. So we'll take that flat, get that taken care of first. And again, it's kind of handy when you've got everything nicely squared up to 90 degrees. And then I actually ended up grinding this whole thing before I turned my camera on. I thought it was running, but you can kind of see I just used my 10-inch contact wheel, put in those little radiuses there. And then what I do is I just jump onto the rotary platen and kind of start the blending process. The rotary platen is really nice because you can still maintain fairly harsh lines. Like, I like to work as angular as I possibly can until I've pretty much got it all done, and then I'll start kind of rounding edges out. I find when you leave the hard lines, you get a better visual of where the material is on the handle. So, rather than kind of hand sanding and rounding everything out right away, if you keep everything at hard lines, you can just see more, okay, this one's thicker here than it is here, we've got more material here than there, and I find that really helps. Once I've got everything really close, then I kind of round it out. And finish up with the scalloped belt, and this is just for blending purposes. Really, we're not very far off from a finished handle here. Essentially, we're just going to kind of clean it up. Now, one thing that did happen with these scales, I end up seeing there's some holes here. I don't know if I would buy scales from this supplier again. I wasn't overly impressed with them, but I just used some CA glue there. We filled those up, and then we went ahead and did our finished sanding. Took everything up to 2000 grit, and then to finish this off, I'm just using some Boost Block oil, which is basically like it's some food safe mineral oil with some beeswax. I don't know for sure, but a key ingredient is it's food safe because obviously it's a kitchen knife, and I want to make sure there's no issues there. Now, I sharpened this on the paper wheels. I forgot to film it. I thought the camera was running, and I looked over and it was turned off. But it took less than 5 minutes to sharpen this thing up. The edge thickness before sharpening was 12 thousandths of an inch. So really just a couple of passes on the paper wheels, and then I hit it with the leather strop there. We had this thing really nice and sharp. We did the paper towel cut test there, and it passed that. And then last year sometime, I don't know how or why, but a telephone book was delivered to our mailbox. And I was so thrilled because, voila, this is one of my favorite sources to test cuts with. Obviously, the paper towel is a good test, but you can feel how it cuts through the paper. And the key thing, a lot of people think, what does it do? When you're cutting paper, you basically want to kind of run it along the entire length of that edge just to feel if there's any places that are snagging. Because sometimes you'll get, most of it just perfect, and then right in the middle, there'll be one little spot that cuts a little bit differently. Well, that's obviously one spot you need to just work on a little bit. So I find the really thin paper is one of my favorite ways to test an edge, just to see what it's doing there. And here we have the finished product. You can kind of get a look at the Coke bottle profile. I kind of left the pommel area kind of swelled out a little bit because this is a heavier knife, right? This isn't a real delicate, intricate knife. I'm not entirely sure what kind of work this will end up doing. The gentleman that bought this is a chef, and it'll be interesting, but I found this really, really comfortable. That swell for the palm there within the Coke bottle just fits really great, feels good, and even when you choke up on the blade a bit, there's a lot of nice control there. Anyways, guys, I just want to say again, I thank you so much for your support here on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions whatsoever, please do not hesitate to put them below. I'll do whatever I can to answer them. Thank you guys so much for watching. Cheers.